Political independence can be remembered in speeches, proclamations, and battles won, but a revolution will never be conceived out of a vision. They arise out of a pressure of economy, a pressure of population, a pressure of institutions, and when a system can no longer contain them. The American Revolution is far more than a war against a distant king. It is the point of a historically complicated system which had become inconsistent in economy, inflexible in politics, overextended in strategy. In the mid-18th century, British North America was not a poor or colonial backwater. Instead, it was among the richest parts of the Atlantic world. The colonies enjoyed an abundance of land, a rapidly growing population, a series of improving ports, and a developing commercial class.
Colonial merchants were engaged in trading timber, fish, grain, tobacco, rice, and peltry across the Atlantic, Caribbean, and even Europe via a series of overland trade connections. This wealth did not coexist with the British Empire, but initially because of it. Britain's imperial system was based on mercantilism.
The colonies were meant to benefit Britain. They were a source of natural resources, a market for manufactured goods, and trade took place in large part inside the imperial system. A closed economy theoretically worked well for all participants. However, this model worked in practice only when Britain did not have a strong administrative presence in the colonies.
Britain did not have a strong administration in the colonies for a very long time. Furthermore, this meant colonial Britain had a great deal of leeway. Such an autonomy influenced the expectations in the colonies. The assemblies were responsible for taxation. Cases were heard in colonial courts. The militia replaced the need for an army.
The colonies were far from London, and thus governance occurred in a way that was local in nature. The colonists were subjects of Britain, but were accustomed to taking care of their own matters. That delicate balance began to unravel with the 7 Years' War, but it is known in North America by another name, the French and Indian War. The war from 1756 to 1763 was a world war and pushed Britain's finances to their limits. Britain won this war, making France a non-entity in North America. However, this victory had a steep price tag attached to it. The national debt nearly doubled. Britain found it costly to maintain armies in this vastly expanded territory. Britain's leaders decided that because the colonies were direct beneficiaries of this war, they were supposed to share this cost. As far as London was concerned, this demand was fair. To the colonies, it represented a direct reversal of precedent. The first major point of contention was taxation. The Sugar Act of 1764 increased the enforcement of customs and added new taxes. Then came the Stamp Act of 1765, which taxed official documents, newspapers, and other print materials. For the first time, direct taxes were imposed inside the colonies by Great Britain without the approval of colonial legislatures. The amount wasn't in question. No taxation without representation violated their rights as Englishmen, the colonists argued.
Parliament explained the colonies were granted virtual representation in Parliament because they represented the whole empire, not particular localities. Such an explanation had a sound basis in English political tradition. Such an explanation defied common sense in a colony where they enjoyed complete control over local taxation.
The resistance escalated quickly. Protests rose up. Boycotts were organized against British goods. Merchants drew up non-importation agreements. Crowds intimidated tax collectors. In some instances, collectors chose to resign when faced with laws they did not want to enforce. The Stamp Act was repealed, but Parliament followed through with the Declaratory Act in order to establish their right to legislate in all instances for the colonies.
Those were important words. They meant that the war was not a phase. In fact, this war was structural. The Parliament, over a period of a decade, tried to regain control over the colonies through a series of acts: the Townshend Acts, which were imposed on imported goods, the Tea Act, which gave the East India Company a monopoly over trade, and the Coercive Acts, which were a consequence of the Boston Tea Party and were imposed on the state of Massachusetts.
Boston emerged as a hub of resistance. To maintain order, British troops were placed in Boston. Tension existed between these troops and locals. In 1770, a skirmish turned into a massacre, resulting in the deaths of 5 Americans.
This incident quickly gained notoriety in history as the Boston Massacre. However, colonial resistance also grew in intellect during these years.
Pamphlets were widely circulated. The authors of these pamphlets stated that liberties were not a matter of government favor, but were rights inherent in nature. They were influenced by Enlightenment thoughts concerning consent, sovereignty, and social contracts. Such thoughts were instrumental in shifting this colonial struggle into a different orbit.
The struggle ceased being solely over taxes. The colonial leaders saw a need to coordinate their efforts. By 1774, the First Continental Congress met to bring resistance leaders together. They presented a petition to the king, called for boycotts, and stated colonial rights. But rather than a response of accommodation, Britain answered with power.
April 1775 saw battles erupt in Lexington and Concord. British troops were trying to seize colonial military supplies. Militia stood in opposition. Gunfire rang out. The war did not start with a declaration of independence, but rather with a disagreement over authority and shots being fired. Early in the war, the imbalance in strength between both sides became apparent. Britain had the most powerful navy in the world and a professional army. The colonies had no unified command, access to stable funding, or official recognition. They did have geography on their side, support, and incentive. George Washington was named the command head of the Continental Army. He had a lot on his shoulders.
His troops were ill-trained, ill-paid, and ill-equipped. Desertion in his army had become a norm. His troops were struggling to survive, especially during Valley Forge. They won through perseverance. Meanwhile, political change quickened. Common Sense appeared in January 1776. Thomas Paine wrote it. Paine used simple, understandable language.
Common Sense assailed monarchy in general and called for complete independence. Common sense circulated widely. Public sentiment shifted. Reconciliation with Britain appeared not only impossible, but unwanted. In July 1776, colonial leaders approved the Declaration of Independence. The declaration stated much more than a declaration of independence. In fact, it stated a philosophy for revolution. Governments were put in place to protect rights. When these governments were ineffective, a people had the right to have them changed or abrogated. Such a premise seemed revolutionary. The Declaration of Independence heightened the intensity of the conflict. Britain had a rebellion to quell. Now it had a rival political power to eliminate.
The outcome of the war was equally influenced by strategy rather than ideology. Britain sought to isolate rebellious zones and regain control in the loyalist regions. The colonies sought to survive until they got assistance from abroad. The strategy worked. France, which had a desire to weaken its imperial rival, offered very important help. Money, weapons, naval superiority, and troops caused a shift in balance. Indirect support for Britain came from Spain and Dutch Republic. The war went global once again. The turning point occurred in 1781 at Yorktown. Cornered by American troops, Cornwallis, with a French fleet blocking all escapes via the ocean, had no choice but to surrender.
Although battles were taking place in other parts of the colonial territories, in England, a will to continue with the war had disintegrated. In 1783, Britain recognized the independence of America. The impact of the revolution went beyond the battlefields. A new state had emerged, the United States, a state based on ideological principles, not monarchism.
Power derived from constitutional documents. Sovereignty rested with the people. Such ideologies would influence future revolutionaries in France, Latin America, and other parts of the world. Economically, independence meant reality for this new nation. The protective umbrella and trade agreements with Britain were gone.
The U.S. had debt, inflation, and divisions. Reality also meant opportunities not available before. Trade expanded, Western expansion quickened, political experimentation started. The course of the American Revolution did not have to be inevitable. A series of actions, errors, and dynamics led to the start of this revolution.
Britain misjudged colonial opposition. Colonists misjudged imperial determination. No one completely controlled a situation when violence escalated. But it was not victory in war that ensured the endurance of the revolution, but rather institutionalized follow-through.
The independence achieved a life of its own because it was institutionalized, deliberated, and articulated in governance. War brought separation. The Constitution brought continuity. In essence, the American Revolution illustrates a very important dynamic of power, the importance of legitimacy. Empires can enforce a set of rules, but they can't very well enforce belief. When a sense of illegitimacy settles over a given system, no matter how powerful it may be, it will soon reach a precarious state.
The United States of America did not gain independence based on its fighting capability. It gained independence because an imperial system, which worked before, did not fit into the reality it ruled over. The revolution was where the structure failed, and a new political order replaced it.